I'm so delighted to be here amongst this very special tribe. And, it just seems like, yes, this is where I belong. And I'm so happy I'm speaking with all of you. So I'm going to speak about something that does draw upon some of the elements that, Eric just spoke about, but then it's also very different. So just for context, these, 20 odd years that I've been here with HFI, it's been the story has been because of all the diversity of work that we do. I've had the opportunity to design experiences that are, of course, efficient and easy to use and delightful and persuasive for people who are wanting to engage with banking sites and apps or healthcare or e-commerce or what have you. But what I have also had the good fortune, and I really consider myself fortunate, is I've also been able to work with communities who are very marginalized. And whether that is in India, whether that's in Indonesia, whether that's in Africa, in South Africa. Africa is one of my favorite continents, and work that I, had the privilege to therefore do in townships in South Africa or in similar habitations in India. All of this has constantly bothered me, who am I as a designer? Who am I really designing for? And how do I make sure that I am designing for those who are not always visible? They're not always on the radar when one does, commercial projects. And that's where this interest in the subaltern has come about. And so who is the subaltern? It's a term used from the social sciences, from sociology, actually. And what I mean by the subaltern is everybody who's an underclass in society, who is not given a chance to be present or be visible because of the dominant ways that society seems to function. And so this is from a game design paper in one of the HCI journals. And you'll see that it's all about the way they've defined the subaltern is those who are working class or unattractive or old or not literate, coming from minority communities, don't know English well, dark skin, so on and so forth. So that's what I mean. People who seem to get punished because they don't have representation in terms of those who create products and services, or those who create technology solutions. There is this underclass, this subaltern population who just don't have a say. And it's only recently, in fact, it's in the last couple of years, that a lot is being said and talked by technologists about this. And several technologists around the world, but particularly in the USA, have raised their voices saying, we did not come into the area of technology to create a world full of such divisions. And, if you look at the reports that are being published about the digital dystopia, in other words, how poorer people are getting completely left behind with the digitization that we are seeing in the world. It should have been the other way around. Digitization and digital transformation is an opportunity to correct a lot of the structural sort of inequalities that we have in this physical world. We have a chance to do it differently in how we create our digital experiences and systems. But apparently that is not happening. And so you can see these series of articles and reports, whether it's in the sort of popular newspapers or in academia, talking about how we are automating poverty in the way we are doing digital transformation in the areas of, say, welfare payments to people who subsist on the benefits payments they get. And this is true for across the world. And so the thing is, as people have started to talk about this, we've got some very strong voices. Now, for example, automating inequality, talking about how we must take into account the subaltern in terms of any development of technology and design of technology. And so Virginia Eubanks, who's a political scientist, very, very well regarded around the world now because of this very seminal work that she brought to the world, where she looks at different systems that have been designed, and the way those systems have been designed takes for granted a certain way that the end users are going to behave. End users are going to be familiar with a certain set of things, a certain mental model that the end users have, which is all not correct. So somewhere designers may not have been involved, and she makes the point, in some places designers were involved, but perhaps did not have that much of a presence. The result is, what if you are somebody who does not have access to the internet, does not have much savviness with technology, and your life depends on that grant you get, which now is just automated, and you don't know how to make sense of that system, because the people who you would be in touch with at the welfare office, the benefits office, whatever it may be in different parts of the world, they are not there anymore. And how have we designed this technology to take care of all these different kinds of people who represent, the invisibility that we have somehow created and the fault lines in our societies? There's this incident which really deeply disturbed me, and I first saw it in Virginia Eubanks, one of her webinars actually, where she talks about a daily wage laborer in central India who, because the government, like all other governments, to make things efficient, lower cost, they switched all the benefit payments to an entire digital system created by big tech. And of course, everybody had good intent, but nobody was researching the ecosystem. And so there was this particular person who represents actually a larger population. One day, as he went to get his monthly payment, the benefit payment, this is all that he gets in order to live, it had been switched to biometrics. There was nobody there to take his, identity card and all of that. And he had no clue how to do the biometric, how to use the thumb for where, etc. He tried. And after 3 attempts, the system said, you're not recognized as a valid recipient. And so when the computer said no payment, he had no recourse to finding out what to do. Even when he did manage to trek to the office, which had now been shifted miles away, the people in the office didn't even know what to do because it's all automated. And by the time they started to move things and figure out, what had happened where to this particular number that this person was represented in the system as, Manji died because of starvation. And this created a lot of hue and cry about, well, how are we designing these systems? Why is it that we do such a great job when we are designing for big e-commerce platforms or large entities where designers are involved and they're given a lot of space to do their work, to use their abilities. But when it comes to systems that are for public welfare, public utility, suddenly there seems to be no need. Is it because the people at the other end who are the users are just invisible? They are the subaltern, so one doesn't have to pay any attention to them. So Virginia Eubanks, she's coined this term called the digital poorhouse, saying instead of doing away with those physical poorhouses, that existed in the UK, and even she mentions early years of the century in the US, she says, instead of doing away with all of that, which we could have, we've created digital poorhouses, and we are locking people in who do not have any way, because of the way it's designed, of getting out of that situation. And she cites some absolutely heart-rending cases from the USA, also very similar to the one that I told you about India. So it's very real and it's very global. And that's what then, got many people to look at. So can we design, or do we need to design differently if we are to look at the subaltern in the context where it's extremely necessary, then comes the question, well, isn't inclusive design, which has been around for a long time, we've been talking about universal design and inclusive design and designing for the next billion, all of this has been around. So isn't that the same thing? Well, apparently not. And so while all, both inclusive design, universal design, initiatives like design for the next billion users, these are extremely important, and it is bringing about more equity in terms of how infrastructure, technology infrastructure, internet infrastructure, access to these can become more equal rather than skewed towards only those who have certain kinds of resources or abilities. While this is being done, but what I believe universal design, inclusive design, the fundamental philosophy is this, that if you have a voice, then speak for those who don't by following principles of inclusive design, universal design. And that's great. But what I would, contend is let the subaltern speak. Let us not forever be the voices for those who should be. They should have their own voice, and can design make that happen? And I strongly believe design is one of the very few disciplines that can make it happen. And so what is it that should be done differently? Well, one is we've got to design with the community and not for. In inclusive design, in universal design, we design for a community, but we are the experts. We come, we listen, whether deeply or, depending on how much time and budget, whatever it is, but we listen, and then we come up, we privilege our own creativity, and we come up with solutions. That's good. But it's very different from being there with the community and enabling the community to start to ideate and think about what it is that would be, good for them. What is it they look forward to? And then as designers, we can put forth our abilities to make all of that come together. So that's the, designing with the community rather than for the community. Some cultures already have constructs, and I have these two because I'm familiar with both cultures and I have worked in both. So there is Ubuntu, which is, very African, very sort of, it is at the heart of this shift. It's about togetherness. It's about, there's no one expert who comes and gives the solutions. It's about, we all exist because I exist because of all, and we all exist because of each other. And Philippines has Malasakit, which is, again, it's this compassion to come up with a solution, but it's through a common struggle. We are all in it together in the same manner. I'm not the expert who is going to stand on a pedestal and listen to you, and then I, come up with my solution. I think the more we shift to these more community-oriented ways of thinking, the more we enable voices of those who are left out, who are oppressed otherwise, for their voices to emerge. And the movements have started happening. Design Justice, which first came out as a book released by MIT Press, Sasha Constanza Schock, she also has created a whole network called the Design Justice Network, which actually preceded the book. Nobody knew as much about it as after the book has been published. And if you follow this sort of, these conversations on Twitter or any of the other social media networks, but particularly Twitter, it's created such an enormous level of interest from a lot of young designers, fresh out of design school from across the world. And it's so encouraging to see how young designers are saying, oh, this is a different way. In school, we are taught a little bit about, communities and, how you design for social innovation, but not these principles, not that the community must have agency and we must be enablers instead of we are the ones who have the agency. Or this equity-centered community design process. It's a whole, it's a document with guidelines. It has a lot of techniques from indigenous, sort of healing techniques, indigenous cooperation techniques, all put together to create a design framework. But it is so different from, the design frameworks where we only foreground certain success criteria, such as efficiency, such as delight, but delight for who is the question. And these are these kinds of responses to the horrific divisions that digital transformation is leading us to reinforce. These responses are very, very interesting. And if you're interested, I can send you more about these, or you can even look up on the net. There's a lot that these ladies have started doing, design justice and equity-centered community design. So while it's designing with communities and not for, the other is designing with values, with universal human values, which one needs to keep there right in front. Just like Eric talked about the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals that the United Nations has put there as sort of ways to constantly think about these areas that need to be changed, because there is so much inequality in each of these areas. And so to be able to say, when we are designing as designers in our design process, to say, what values are we always going to keep in mind? What goals are we trying to achieve? Instead of, just looking at perhaps principles that make us understand human behavior, make us deeply understand human performance parameters. Those are very important. But I think even more important is we've got to say what values. And of movements like Tech Will Not Build It. This is a movement that has gained ground, particularly in the USA in the last maybe a year and a half, 2 years max, where a community of technology, developers, data scientists, they've come together to say, if there are projects that anybody in that group, they're getting a project either from the government or from, a corporate agency, etc., which they feel is harmful, goes against fundamental human values, then they come together as a group and say, Tech will not build this. We are not going to build a system that further reinforces these inequalities that our societies have had for centuries. So I think that's happening because they are foregrounding values on which they will base their very sophisticated technology solutions. And hence they're able to look at and discern and say, this we won't do, and this we will. So I think that's very important when we look at designing for the subaltern population across the world. And finally, designing with critical thinking. Critical thinking, which comes from, again, the social sciences, and increasingly, if you've been through a design school in the last 1 or 2 years, most design schools have started to pivot towards integrated critical thinking or critical theory into the design curriculum, which wasn't the case, earlier when one studied design. Then it was purely design processes without any of the critical theory coming from sociology or anthropology. But now that has come in, and critical thinking really enables you to ask some deep fundamental questions about, why am I doing this? What is it that I'm trying to achieve? And I'll give you a short example. We are currently working on an initiative. This is designing with a community in in central India, in an area called Bastar. That area is a very rich area in terms of natural resources, but is a very, very poor area because of various structural issues that have prevented people from benefiting equally from the resources that they all are, that belong to everyone. There's also a huge conflict. There's a Maoist movement that runs through that area because of the tremendous, sort of inequality in that area. There has been support for extreme left-wing movements. And it's a movement that has led to a lot of violence, a lot of bloodshed. And so that entire corridor is called the Red Corridor in India. And this is a non-profit agency run by an ex-BBC journalist who belongs to that area. And he left his journalism and came back there because he felt so strongly about the need to do something that would, enable the tribal population, which is the majority of the population there, to have a voice without engaging in violence. And so we work with this NGO called CGNet. And how did we apply critical thinking? Well, what we would have done if we hadn't applied critical thinking, if we just did our traditional design process. So let me show you in a moment. Who are we designing for? People, they're nomadic, tribal, very close to their land. It's shifting agriculture. They speak a language that, most of them speak a tribal language that most of India does not know, very isolated, lots of military activity because of the Maoist movement that's been going on for a while now. They're illiterate mostly, but able to oral ways of communication works very well. They can't read or write, so on and so forth, right? What this NGO has, and we've been making it better, is an IVR system, which works so that if anybody in that area has a grievance that they are being exploited in some way, they are being physically abused in some way, they can just call a free number and they can listen to others who have recorded grievances if they wish to. So they understand that they don't have to be scared. There are other people who have also, said the same thing. Or even if they find that other people have said, but they would like to talk about their own grievance, they just have to talk into the phone. It's recorded, and there's a back-end team in the NGO who sorts and categorizes all these recordings, and then they're all published on the website and the app. What that does is it puts a lot of pressure on the government officials in the area to influence a cleanup to happen, so that if there's somebody who's being exploited in some way, there's clear evidence, it's been verified. Now, because of this being made public, action happens. And this has led to, the tribal population feeling really good about what CGNet does for them. And this whole system, that's all oral. So there is very little that has to be done, which needs them to read anything, because that is a weakness. So this is something we helped. Many others have helped. We've helped from HFI, from our nonprofit. And what we would do is the traditional ideation, and this is from a recent project for this that design students did with us. So a design student captured this very well, saying, we were looking at this and going through the traditional user-centered design and saying, where are the inefficiencies? How can you allow people to see and give them a way to vote and say, this issue is very important. Yes, there are so many recordings, but this is the one that I think is very important. So give them a way and give the nonprofit easier way to see what is really important for people. How can you use machine learning and AI? How does it help us understand who all are calling, categorize, different ways of therefore reaching them quickly, et cetera, et cetera? Can you allow people to share some of the messages? All of these things, how can you make the inputs easier? So classical things that we must do. Without that, of course, it's not going to work. And how do you make people maybe know how to repeat things or skip things? All these were not done very well in the system. But okay, now that we understand the community, we could change all this. Then we started to think about it critically. And interesting, this is the student who first did it in following a traditional user-centered design process. Then we exposed him to critical thinking. And then he looked at the same system. Some of the things were the same, the efficiencies that are needed. But he started to now ask, why? Is this really what should be done? Is it just enough to make a tribal person being heard? What about including them in much, much more? Why are we not doing that? How are we changing anything by just making somebody, record a message? And are we really ignoring the deeper issues here? Why do you have to think of an app when many of them can't afford the internet services? Why can't we connect with policymakers and activists through the digital, the website, etc.? Why is it not like that? So questions about why structurally, how can we change things instead of just making the experience efficient emerged by thinking about the community as one I am part of, not that I will come and make some things better for you. So that's how, working with the community, working with values that we say we will never breach, and then thinking critically and saying much beyond what is needed to make this set of digital assets, real assets. What do we really need to do? And we would never be able to do this last thing without immersion with the community, never. So this part, I want to also thank Pranav, who's the student whose work I just showed, and the design school with which we are working, as well as our own nonprofit part that works on this project and other such, subaltern design projects. So I feel at the end of the day, we as the design community, we are in a unique position to be the conscience keepers of a world where technology is everywhere. And that's great. But somebody's got to look at it and say, why? Why are you doing it this way? And who is it benefiting? And more importantly, who is it leaving out? So we have a role. Design is a discipline which teaches us. We talk about empathy all the time. And that's what really helps in being the conscience keepers. Design is very multidisciplinary. We are always embracing from other disciplines. And so we're very open about taking from other areas and enriching the way we do design. So I think we're in a very unique position. And therefore, my contention is we should start to think about how can we, in our various sort of spheres of influence, look at where are people who are invisible and don't have a voice? How can we make them have the voice that they definitely need to speak out? So thank you. That's all I have.
All right. Thank you, Apala. So this is the break time normally. Apala, do you want to answer a few questions? Because we do have some questions. We have some upvotes of them. Should we eat into the break a little bit, guys? I hope that's not a problem for any of the panelists, but I feel like that might be a good thing to do since there's these questions with upvotes. Is that all right, Apala?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So the one with the most upvotes, what tips do you recommend to avoid group bias when crowdsourcing and when conducting design workshops?
Okay. Though this is not quite in this sort of the topic of subaltern, but nevertheless. So I think when crowdsourcing, crowdsourcing is one way of getting more ideas, and design workshops, it has its own mechanics of what you do there. So I think in crowdsourcing, it's a little easier because you're getting different ideas that you have asked for a particular objective. And when you get those, now it's for you to see, are your objectives being met by these ideas? And which ideas meet your objectives much more than maybe other ideas, which are also very good, and maybe for a different objective, so not meeting your particular objective. So I think crowdsourcing is a matter of categorizing and being able to make sure the ideas that are the best suited to meet the objective for which you asked for the crowdsourcing in the first place is you bring the two together, right? The design workshops is always, it's a challenge. How do you avoid group bias? Now, there are very many techniques. So we've, normally in HFI, we avoid things like focus groups, but there are some situations where for whatever reason, we've had to do focus groups. So some things, for example, now, if you do a classical focus group, you're asking, right? It's all verbal. You're asking and somebody has to say something. And that's where the rest of the group can be very influenced and biased because of what one person is saying, because of that person seems so authoritative, so confident, et cetera, et cetera. Then everybody's, going in one direction. And you don't know whether everybody's thinking that. That's one kind of bias that could happen. That can be easily mitigated if you intersperse the verbal discussions with very quick polls. And now doing polls is very easy. There's so many technology platforms, etc., available. But even before that, we would just leave sheets of paper with a question for which we needed everybody's individual comment or vote without them talking to each other or seeing what everybody else is doing. And that The moment you collect that and you can see that there are people who, when they were talking, they didn't voice a contrary opinion. They didn't voice something that was completely different from what the group seemed to have agreed upon. But now when they're doing their individual, sort of giving us their opinions individually, it's different. So that's one group speak that you can avoid. Now, group bias. So if you've selected the group well, keeping in mind the criteria that would really make them diverse, and what are those criteria, therefore becomes very important. And if those criteria are good, the selection criteria is good to have a diverse group, then the chances of the bias, a group bias emerging, is much lower. That's what I can say from my experience.
Awesome. Thank you, Apala. All right. We have another question. So I think probably want to give people a minute or two to break after this. So we'll just do this one last question. It has 4 upvotes as the other one did.
Okay.
The question is, how do we access the subaltern? How do we recruit them for participation in design?
Very good question. And the answer is you have to go there. You have to go to them. You have to make that journey, literally and metaphorically, to go where the subaltern, in your context, the subaltern is situated. So therefore, if I was in, Kailicha or Soweto or Dharavi, I had to go there. I had to be there. I could not, it was not in any way fair to think that I would bring anybody. Now, the moment you go there and you immerse yourself there, that's where you access the people, their lives, their everyday situations. All of that you access by being there. And then it's easier to form trust and to also be ethical and be clear why you want to talk to somebody. But I have found that once, if you really deeply care, people are so willing to talk, so willing to share about, what their perspective is on the topic that you are interested in. But you have to go there. And once you go there, recruiting in that sense here, it's really not recruiting, it's really collaborating and working together, that becomes much, much, much easier.